What's the difference between helping someone because it's useful to you versus doing it because you trust them, because you care for them even? And when does someone stop being a stranger or a co-worker or just someone who happens to be in the same boat as you completely at random and become a friend? I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I seem to be the last person who's finished reading Project Hail Mary, just in time for the movie as it turns out. And it really got to me. Because the book, and the movie too, is, as we philosophers say, very sneaky. While our hero, Ryland Grace, is running a whole load of hard sci-fi experiments to save the universe, that book and movie are secretly running experiments on us too, because they suddenly strip away everything we normally rely on to judge whether we can truly trust a stranger. You know, one with no shared culture, or no shared history, or no common language, not even a common atmosphere. And I'll admit it, humanity doesn't have the best track record when it comes to trusting even people who look vaguely like us, let alone a bunch of rocks. And yet, Project Hail Mary asks us, really calls us out and asks us, against all of those staggering odds, can that stranger become our friend? And what would you risk to find out? Now, before we go any further, spoilers. All of them, all of the spoilers. Sorry, for the book and for the film too. So if you haven't read it or watched it yet, go and do that first and come back. It is a fun ride, I promise, and it is worth it. At least I think so. But we just can't talk about the philosophy of the two without discussing what really happens in them. And a quick note while I'm at it. I'm working primarily from the book for this, which if you've only seen the film, yeah, go ahead and give it a read. Because a lot of what makes it philosophically interesting lives in stuff like Grace's internal monologue, stuff like the slow reconstruction of who he is and why he's there. The film compresses that quite a bit and handles some of the characters differently. But the ideas that we're looking at today, they really run through both. They're not that far apart in the end, so whatever you've come for, I think you'll get it out of this. But a quick refresher, what happens in Project Hail Mary? Well, our hero, Ryland Grace, wakes up on a spacecraft with no memory of who he is or how he got there, and he quickly discovers that his two crewmates are dead. Slowly, through the equipment around him and the memories that kind of trickle back, he pieces it all together. And he realizes that the sun is dying, and not just our sun, but basically every sun in most of the solar systems around us. A microscopic organism called the astrophage is consuming their energy output, and in a matter of decades, the Earth will freeze. Grace is a scientist, a kind of Walter White PhD who left academia and became a middle school science teacher, but breaking good this time. So there's no blue meth, I promise, but there is a Gus in this narrative, and I'll get comments for that, but that's for another video on Eva Strat. Grace is conscripted into a last-ditch mission to figure out what's happening and whether anything can be done about it. Why him is a little convoluted and frankly not the strongest part of the book or film, but here he is, on a one-way trip in the Tau Ceti solar system and alone, until he discovers that he isn't. Another spacecraft sees the giant flash of his engines as he enters the solar system. It turns out that another species has sent their own desperate mission to investigate the same crisis, and has also realized that there's something different about Tau Ceti. That species is what Grace comes to call the Iridians, because that turns out where they're from, the Iridian system. And their sole surviving crew member, an extraordinary engineer, is a creature Grace will come to call Rocky. Now, Rocky breathes ammonia. He communicates in musical tones, and he cannot safely share a room with Ryland Grace. In almost every meaningful sense, they are incompatible. And the two of them have to figure out how to talk to each other, how to trust each other, and together solve a problem that will determine whether either of their civilizations will survive. So that's the setup. And I want to look at this in 5 short parts. First, whether we can even know if another mind is there at all. Whether Rocky or anyone has an inner life anything like yours or mine. And trust me, philosophers have been losing sleep over this one for centuries. Then, how Grace and Rocky build trust from absolute scratch, with, at least initially, no shared language, no shared culture, not even shared air. Then we'll have a look at what they have, whether that counts as friendship at all, or whether it's just two beings doing what they have to do to survive. Aristotle, you'll be unsurprised, had thoughts on this too. Then what happens when you meet someone who has no face, and what that does to everything we think we know about ethics. And finally, why this really resonates with us right now in 2026, when trust is the very thing that we're most running short of. And for me, the question underneath all of this is the question we started with. Can such a stranger truly ever become a friend? And what would we be willing to risk to find out? But first, there's a problem. Before we can even begin making a friend, how can we be sure that there's another person in there at all? And the book is perhaps a little better at giving us all of this from Grace's perspective, because Grace's instruments pick up another vessel, and after some extremely tense manoeuvring and some very reasonable mutual terror, there's a creature on the other side of a window looking back at him. And Grace has no idea what it is, whether it's intelligent, whether it has intentions, whether it can be communicated with at all. This is, in all senses imaginable, the other mind's problem. You can understand as a philosopher how I got very excited when I came to this part, because philosophers have been worried about this problem for a long time. And the worry is this: we suspect that you can't actually prove that anyone else has an inner life, is conscious in the fullest sense of the word, possesses consciousness. Seriously, that's the whole problem. You know that you are. You, after all, have the first-person experience of being you, the sense of there being something that it is like to be inside your own head. But when it comes to everybody else, you're inferring. You observe behavior, you recognize patterns that match your own, or you extend the assumption of consciousness to other humans because they look like you, act like you, report experiences that map onto yours. It's a reasonable inference, but it's still an inference. And the philosopher Thomas Nagel made this problem even more famous and vexing with a deceptively simple question. What is it like to be a bat? Because bats navigate by echolocation. We know this. I like to think about it as basically fancy hearing. Stop bragging about it, bats. But they experience a world through a sense that we don't have and can barely imagine. We can describe the mechanics of it scientifically, but we cannot know from the inside what the experience actually is like. Because there is something that it is like to be a bat. We just have no access to it. Perhaps we can't even begin to conceive of it. And now think about Rocky, who basically sees the world in sound too. Plus, Rocky doesn't breathe the same air as Grace, can't survive in the same environment, has no face in any sense that Grace would recognize, and communicates in something closer to music than language. Every shortcut that normally tells you that there's a mind in there, the things that we unconsciously constantly do with every person we ever meet, has nothing to anchor itself to. Rocky doesn't have any of those things. So it's the problem of other minds on steroids, or at least the mineral-based iridium equivalent of steroids. And I immediately thought of another fantastic hard sci-fi novel that explores this same problem a little, Peter Watts's Blind Sight, which, if you haven't read it, it's very worth a read. It's a banger. And I'm going to spoil the smallest part of it here, revealed pretty early on in the book, it's also a first contact story, and that the aliens there turn out to have no inner life at all. They're very sophisticated, they're responsive, they're extraordinarily capable, almost godlike, in fact, and they are entirely without consciousness. The horror of that book is the suggestion that you don't need to be someone inside to outcompete everybody. And there's no guarantee, should we encounter anything resembling life out there, that they would have any of the features we would recognize at all, like consciousness or memories or a sense of personhood. In Project Hail Mary, Grace, he has a little bit of better luck. Rocky does have an inner life, quite a lot of one, in fact. The philosophical, and it turns out the practical challenge for Ryland Grace is, how do you get close enough to know what kind of mind that Rocky has, what kind of mind it is? Because they need to. And the narrative is honest about how truly hard this is. They're running out of time. They need to solve a civilization-eating problem. And they're both in tin cans with basic technologies. Star Trek: The Next Generation, with magic centers, with built-in translators, with the ability to bark tea, Earl Grey, hot, and have it materialize, well, this ain't. So Rocky and Grace's early exchanges are so tense and so riveting precisely because so much rides on something that could be derailed with the slightest miscommunication and the slightest sense of threat. There's a real possibility at every stage that the whole thing collapses, along with any chance of a happy ending. But then something shifts, and this is the moment in which I think the narrative earns a lot of what comes after and allows us to be a little more forgiving about some of the shortcuts it takes along the way. So Grace and Rocky talk. They learn to talk to each other pretty quickly, actually, and it is fiction, so we do move rapidly past some of the linguistic and conceptual complications that would, in reality, have made this much harder, but put that aside. But Grace discovers that Rocky has a life partner, and that Rocky has shipmates who died getting him here, just like him, and that Rocky mourns them. That Rocky has a life on Erid that he left behind to come on a mission that might kill him. And the effect of that, because when you read it, it's almost immediate, because that's our own understanding of relationality, of what others mean to us, kicking in. We intimately understand the web of connections and losses and obligations that make a person a person. We recognize it instantly, not because we've decoded it scientifically through instruments or whatever, but because we live it ourselves every day. Rocky becomes recognizable as another mind and another person, not through a philosophical proof of consciousness, but through the sudden visibility of his grief and his attachment. And speaking of taking journeys together, if you're enjoying this one, the like button helps enormously and you can subscribe for more. Plus, we have a free Patreon with more videos and behind-the-scenes material where I give some rather unvarnished insights and views and opinions, so links below. But back to the story, because it is a great literary response, I think, to Thomas Nagel's challenge, and one that it kind of took this quick, funny science teacher for me to realise. We understand and come to appreciate the inner lives of others not through any immediate or inferred access to their consciousness themselves, but by recognising how they live as beings in the world and how they too have relationships with others. Of course, that's how we recognise it, because we are social animals to the core, and that sociability, that living amongst others, is what helps us recognise and understand another being from another solar system in this story. The great irony of the book and the film being, of course, that they both realise this at the point where they are the loneliest beings in the universe. It is, in its own small, admittedly mawkish way, beautiful. I teared up a bit, I'll admit it, but for the philosophy, damn it. Which is great. But it doesn't yet solve our problem. It doesn't tell Grace or us what Rocky's inner experience is actually like. Yet it does shift something fundamental. It tells us that if this is a social animal just like us, then perhaps there's the slightest possibility of trust after all. So yes, Project Hail Mary is a story about the most miraculous of friendships. Any video on the book and movie is going to tell you that, and sorry, I'm not immune. Even if I'm a philosopher, I'm only human. But it does do something that I think most stories about friendship don't or can't do, because most stories about friendships get to take a lot of things for granted. And it's a taking for granted with, I think, philosophical consequences, as we'll see. Because Grace and Rocky can't take anything for granted. So if they're going to do anything together, let alone save two civilizations, they have to build the conditions for cooperation from absolute scratch. And what I think the book deserves real credit for is that it actually shows us how. It does it right in front of our very eyes, or ears in Rocky's case. Ears? So yes, let's talk about the parts of the narrative that often get dismissively labelled competency porn, that slightly condescending term that critics reach for when a writer lets their characters be genuinely specifically good at things. Although, getting back to Walter White, isn't Breaking Bad kind of competency porn too, and critics love that. Anyway, but look, I understand the instinct. There's a version of this kind of writing that is just wish fulfillment, just the fantasy of being the smartest person in the room who always has the answer. Or let's say living in a world where the people around you are the right people for the job and the systems just work to solve problems, rather than horrifically consuming each other in a late-stage capitalist frenzy. I get that that would be nice, even if fanciful. But that's not what's happening here, I think. What Weir is doing is showing us the thinking and the learning, the real slow iterative process of two minds trying to find common ground when common ground doesn't exist, quite yet. So they start with mathematics, because mathematics is the one thing that might actually plausibly be universal. Not because it's a human invention, but because it describes the physical relationships that exist, whether or not anyone is around to actually describe them. Rocky and Grace work out that they both count in base 6 and base 10 respectively, for example. Now, tiny little book criticism here. Sorry, there has to be at least one philosopher's nitpick, right? Weir obviously fancies himself as a science enthusiast, and I really wish there'd been a humanities enthusiast too, because he doesn't mention that a bunch of human cultures, both historically and right now, have used a variety of different bases to count. The Oksapmin people of Papua New Guinea, for example, count in base 27 using a body part system, and the ancient Babylonians used a base 60 system, which is frankly wild. And he provides a simple evolutionary explanation for this, which is probably not right. The whole thing is just as much cultural as it is embodied. But I digress. What I'm trying to say here is that we do have crazy alien ways of counting and doing maths right here on Earth too. So from this, Rocky and Grace can build a shared numerical language from the ground up. So measurements can be standardized and understood. The signifier can refer back to the signified in a very concrete way. And at least for me, this is not just a charming shorthand for, and then they became friends, but the actual mechanism of what happens when two minds try to become understood by each other, the first steps of it at least, and work with each other through a shared project. They almost become extensions for each other, where Grace starts to rely on Rocky for the mathematics and the engineering, while Rocky relies on Grace for what he calls the science. And then there are the rituals, which everyone online loves. Things like fist my bump, a human gesture that Rocky mislearns in a way that is charming precisely because the error itself kind of becomes a communication. You just don't want to make that error in a European nightclub, trust me. It also says, I'm not correcting you, Rocky. Keep it. It's ours now. Or there's their own idiosyncratic use of sarcasm, for example, or watching each other sleep, which Grace finds weird and then later kind of misses. It's the kind of being on their own side of the divider while keeping each other company together and building a culture together. And a lot of this isn't strictly necessary for the mission. And yes, it adds flavour to the narrative and makes it a much more enjoyable film and book too. But I think it's a little more than that too, because there's a distinction that philosophers of relationships spend a lot of time on between reliance on the one hand and actual trust on the other. Reliance is what you do when you predict that someone will do something. I rely on my alarm clock, for example, or I rely on the train being roughly on time, which, foolish of me. But none of that involves trust in any meaningful sense, because none of it involves placing something I value in someone else's hands and accepting that they, the person, could let me down. Trust, real trust, is when I make myself vulnerable to you. When I give you access to something that matters to me, knowing that you could betray it, and that I choose to do that anyway. Reliance is a kind of prediction, in a way, but trust is really giving permission. I let you matter to my well-being. What Grace and Rocky build, protocol by protocol and ritual by ritual, is a structure that allows them to move from the first category to the second. They begin by predicting each other, working out what the other will do in a given situation, testing hypotheses, updating expectations, that kind of stuff. That's reliance. But somewhere in the construction of the tunnel, for example, in the labelling of jokes, or in the shared moments on opposite sides of an atmospheric divide, something shifts again. They start placing things in each other's hands, information, for example, that could be dangerous, access that could be exploited. It's time, it's attention, it's care. These are fundamental parts of actual relationships, the things we give to others that we value and we respect. And we, as readers and as viewers, we make that same crossing too, with them, without noticing we've made it. Weir never gives us Rocky's interiority directly. Rocky is always at some level opaque to us. And yet somewhere in the middle of all of this physics and protocol building and fist bumps, we come to trust him. Genuinely emotionally trust him in a way that makes the later sections of the book and the movie kind of hurt the way they do. He has built across 300 pages of hard science the infrastructure of a relationship that trust requires. And by the time we arrive at the moments that cost our characters a great deal, we're already a part of their relationship too. We just didn't notice exactly when that happened. And neither did Rocky or Grace either. Sometimes trust and friendship just sneaks up on us. For me, the most important technology in this story is not the spaceships or the astrophage or the eventual solution to the problem. It's this. It's the slow, deliberate, painstaking construction of the conditions under which trust becomes possible, which turns out to require just as much ingenuity and just as much care as anything else that Grace and Rocky do amidst the loneliness of space. But it wouldn't be me if I didn't make all of that needlessly complicated by asking a rude and philosophically pointed question or two. So here goes. The questions are, does any of it actually count as friendship? Or is it just two beings in an extraordinarily difficult situation doing what they have to do to survive? Because you could tell a story about Grace and Rocky in entirely different terms of incentives. They both need the solution to fighting the astrophage. They both have relevant knowledge the other lacks. The cooperation is real, but maybe it's just a rational response to the circumstances. And once those circumstances change, the relationship could change with them. We can all be, for example, selfish Randian subjects, saving the world and then charging for the privilege. Friendship be damned. But most of us won't. So let's dig into what philosophers say about friendship. Because Aristotle, for example, thought that friendship happens in three broad categories. He seems to have basically written about everything at some point, and that's even when you take into account the fact that we've lost probably half of his original work. Careless of us, really. But Aristotle had some really interesting things to say about friendship. So the three types. The first that he talked about was friendship based on utility. Something like, you're useful to me, I'm useful to you. We maintain the connection while that usefulness holds. Then there's friendship based on pleasure that he identifies. That's kind of like, I enjoy your company, you enjoy mine, like and subscribe. Let's keep it going while the good times roll, that kind of thing. And then there's something that he considered rarer. Friendship based on character, where the other person matters to you not because of what they provide to you, but because of who they are. Kind of where the relationship would survive the end of the utility or the pleasure because the person has become genuinely unique and meaningful to you. Grace and Rocky clearly start in the first category. Their utility to each other is almost cosmically convenient. You couldn't design a more perfect mutual dependence if you tried, basically. But the question the book, I think, is quietly working through in the background is whether it's going to stay that way. And we discover the answer as it goes, when this beautiful relationship starts costing them something, where one of them does something that the cost-benefit analysis that many would run just doesn't justify, and that maybe actively contradicts. For example, there's a moment where the ship is in crisis. It's spinning wildly. Everything breaks loose. Grace is pinned against a monitor and he's running out of air. Rocky could have waited it out. He can handle the centripetal forces. He could have taken his time, improvised something clever, and gotten the ship back under control. He basically just didn't need Grace alive to do any of that. But instead, he leaves his ammonia environment. He risks himself, and he comes into Grace's air to cut him free, burning himself so badly in the process that he nearly dies. And he never really explains why. He doesn't offer an account of his values or lay out the moral framework. He just does it, and then he collapses. Grace then burns his own arms, getting Rocky back to safety. And when Rocky recovers, Grace asks him why he did it. Rocky just says, "You damaged self to save me. Thank." And Grace replies, "You did the same thing." That's it. 8 words and a mirror. Everything that would normally take a long time to establish, stuff like the recognition that the other took a risk for you, the gratitude that implies a debt, the understanding that that debt exists in a moral realm rather than a transactional one, all of that is compressed into 2 lines of a shared language they cobbled together 3 weeks ago. And earlier, while he's dragging Rocky back to safety, Grace asks himself the question the book never quite answers directly. He asks, he could have let me die. He should have, really. Why risk his life and the whole mission for me? No answer is given, which is, I think, part of the point. Rocky didn't do it because he could explain it. He did it because Grace has become someone you do that kind of thing for. So yes, we generally trust people who can articulate their values to us, but the evidence that actually moves us, that changes something in how we feel about a person, is almost always what they do when it costs them something. Rocky never tells Grace he's a good person. He just keeps demonstrating it in conditions of genuine difficulty without making a thing of it at all. And it's there too in Rocky's You sleep, I watch. The words that contain an entire ethical stance. I will absorb the vulnerability so that you don't have to, because that's what you do for someone who matters to you. And by the time we get to the you are friend, which arrives when things are very bad and the outcome is genuinely uncertain, it doesn't feel like a sentimental declaration. It feels like an accurate description of a fact that's been building the whole time. What Aristotle would say, I think, is that Grace and Rocky have done something he considered genuinely rare. They're moved, under almost impossible conditions, from the most instrumental kind of relationship into something with the structure of the third kind, becoming friends who respect and share each other's values. The other has become distinct, it's become important and unique, which is why when Grace eventually makes his own fateful choice at the critical moment, it doesn't feel irrational or sentimental. By that point, for him, it's not even really a choice. And here's something special and a little bit philosophically nerdy, at least to me, because a philosopher that I've mentioned a few times before, Emmanuel Levinas, argued that ethics doesn't begin with principles or rules or calculations about the consequences, which is news to quite a lot of other philosophers. Instead, he thought that it begins in the encounter with another person's face. When you look at another human being in the face and they look back at you, something happens before you've even had time to think about it. The face makes a demand on you before the argument, before the theory, before you've even decided whether this person deserves your consideration or not. It says, I am here. Respond to me. Sure, you can slag off a profile pic and a name on the internet. Lord knows we've all done it. But it's much different to shout at or do violence to the very real person right in front of you, staring you in the face, particularly if they're vulnerable or under your power. At least it is for most people. Sure, that kind of thing still happens, but it's an obstacle, a hurdle. But it's much harder than anonymous violence, is Levinas's argument. Or it would have been. He died blissfully unaware of the internet in 1995. Lucky him. But anyway, what he is arguing is that the obligation to another arrives well before the decision. The face interrupts you. But that's really interesting because Rocky has no face. Not metaphorically, he literally has no face in the book and the movie. There is no face in any sense that Levinas seems to have in mind. If the ethical encounter requires a face, and the face requires, even implicitly, a certain kind of mutual visibility and vulnerability, then Levinas's framework simply doesn't apply, right? And you might think that that's a reason to put Levinas to the side entirely. But I think that's the wrong move. Because the narrative does something really clever when you look at it carefully. It asks what the face is actually doing, what function it serves in that ethical encounter, and then it finds other ways to do the same thing. Because think about what the face communicates. It communicates vulnerability. It's exposed or undefended. It's the part of you most available to damage and most accessible to others. It's expressive. It has the involuntary signals of emotion, attention, and distress. And it has presence, the sheer undeniable there-ness of another being who is there with you right now, making a claim on your attention. Now think about what Rocky communicates. His musical tones carry something too, which is a part of why the audiobook, I think, became such a phenomenon. There's a music beneath the language, and the listeners responded to it in a way that surprised, I think, even them. And it's because music speaks to us in an emotional language, below articulation. And that register is not so different from what Levinas thinks the face is doing. It bypasses the reasoning part of our brain and lands somewhere much more immediate, somewhere that creates an obligation before calculation. And then there's the network of clear xenonite tubes and spacers that Rocky builds inside the Hail Mary itself. I think this is worth pausing on because it's stranger and more significant than it might first appear. Rocky constructs a parallel habitat inside, which means that Rocky and Ryland are, for most of the book, cohabitating. They're roommates, working side by side in the lab through the membrane, visible to each other in the control room or sleeping in adjacent compartments. They are present to each other constantly, across a barrier that would kill either of them if it failed. It is a piece of engineering, built for practical reasons, sure, but it's also something else entirely. It's a deliberate architecture of proximity. and exposure, in which two beings who cannot touch or breathe the same air are as close to each other as their respective biologies will permit. It's a little poetic. And Levinas talks about the face-to-face moment as something that happens to you. You encounter the other, and the encounter creates the obligation. But Grace and Rocky build that encounter. Rocky literally constructs the conditions under which the ethical demand can arise, room by room, inside Grace's ship, which raises a really sincere question that Levinas doesn't quite ever grapple with. If you engineer proximity like this, is the responsibility that emerges from it any less real? The narrative's answer, I think, is no. And the act of building those rooms, of choosing to be present rather than communicating at a safe, invisible distance, is itself already an act of ethical commitment. It's that trust made physical, perhaps even before the trust itself is fully established. What Levinas was identifying, I'd suggest, is a phenomenon rather than a mechanism. What makes the face an ethical event is not the face itself, but what the face does. It makes the other's vulnerability visible, their presence undeniable, their claim on you unavoidable. Rocky's voice does some of this. The Xenite walls do some of this. You can see through them, which means you cannot pretend that the other is not there, making demands on you. We might be, entirely without intending to, updating Levinas for a universe in which the beings you encounter most urgently might not have anything you'd recognize as a face. But the ethical encounter is real. The obligation is real. The face is really just one way that it can happen. So, it's a story about friendship. We know this. And I've just spent a lot of time dissecting what friendship means and why it makes ethical demands on us. Why, despite some of the more humanities-focused shortcomings in Weir's narrative, and maybe I'll put a second video out about that too, I think it's still doing philosophically interesting work. Because we're far enough into the video where I can be completely honest with you. I did not like this book. I have a lot of criticisms of it. I think it falls short in a lot of ways, and I almost threw it across the room during a certain courtroom scene. Basically, I think that Weir is often a bad writer. I'm sorry if you love this book, but that's just my view. And one that does not understand kind of how humans work, or at least can't express it on the page. The flashbacks to Ryland Grace's time on Earth is, for me, often a little embarrassing. He doesn't do human-to-human dialogue well, and for all of the effort that Weir put into getting the science right, he sometimes gets everything else woefully wrong. Like secret unanimous votes at the UN, but don't think about it is basically what Strat says. Anyway, one subjective opinion. Please disagree in the comments. I do deserve your disagreement on this. And yet again. So I did not like this book, but I did really enjoy it, which is weird. I know. I came away from it with a spring in my step. It gave me something that I needed. It gave me hope, basically. Real concrete hope. It reminded me that we can hope and we can act. And I think this is why so many people love and respond so joyfully to this book and to the movie, which I think is great, and the movie actually fixes a few of the problems I had in the process too. But I think all of this happens because we are exhausted. I'm not the first one to say it. This is probably where I put in a clip of John Oliver saying all of this loudly and cathartically for all of us.
You might well be exhausted, confused, scared, and running on fucking fumes right now.
And I mean something specific by that, not just the tired in the general civilizational sense, though that too, but tired of a particular story. One where the answer to an impossible problem is one extraordinary person working alone, who's simply smarter and more capable than everyone else around them. The lone genius, the chosen one, the man who figures it all out, because why is it always a man? Men, we have a bit of a problem here, while everyone else is still catching up. We've been sold that story a lot lately, in fiction and outside of it. You know, I alone can fix it. And I think a lot of us have quietly stopped believing it. Not because those kind of geniuses don't exist, but because the problems that we're actually facing, the ones that keep us up at night, the ones that seem to be getting worse rather than better, none of them are going to be solved by one person working alone. They require cooperation across difference. They require trust between people who have very little obvious reason to trust each other. And that kind of trust, the hard, unglamorous kind, doesn't make for a very satisfying hero myth. I think there's also, underneath all of that, a more personal exhaustion, or at least that's what I'm feeling. The one that comes from extending goodwill constantly and finding that it wasn't reciprocated. From watching people choose cruelty over inconvenience or something else. It's that slow accumulation of evidence that cynicism is just easier. And I've done a whole video on how this is in this moment, how distrust is smarter than hope, etc., etc., etc. And into all of that context comes this book and the film as well, which is, I want to be clear, almost relentlessly cheerful and problem-solving and full of fuel calculations. It is not a grim book. It is, in many respects, a genuinely fun book. And yet, its emotional core turns out to be exactly the thing we've been most depleted by. The question of whether trust across a seemingly impossible gap is still worth attempting. Grace is not an optimist. He's terrified. He misreads signals. The situation keeps getting worse, and the problems don't resolve cleanly. Every solution generates a new complication, and the odds are almost impossible at every stage. They're not good. But what he does instead, and what Rocky does across the divide, in his own language and with his own uncertainties, is keep going. Working away quietly and helping out. They both keep extending those small acts of trust that the situation requires, not because the success is guaranteed, but because stopping means the experiment fails and they let everybody down. The weight on their shoulders is immense, but they break that down bit by bit, that huge weight, and they work on it bit by bit. And it reminds me that there's a distinction that philosophers draw between optimism on the one hand and hope. Optimism is basically a probability estimate, really, when we come down to brass tacks, that things will probably work out, that the odds are in our favour. But hope is something different and something much harder. We know this. Hope doesn't require the probability estimate to be favourable. In fact, it's pretty much essential, as we see when the odds are stacked against us. It's just a commitment to act as though the thing you are doing is worth doing, even when you can't be sure that it is. It's the decision to keep going, not because you know how it ends, but because the alternative, giving up on the possibility, is way worse. The narrative does have a relentless rhythm. Problem solved, new problem, keep going. And the fuel there isn't the astrophagia or even optimism, it's hope, dispensed one little step at a time. And when, for us, things seem so insurmountable, we really need that, one little step at a time. Grace doesn't save the world by being a genius. He does it, insofar as he does it, by not doing it alone, by accepting help from a being he had no framework for, and by building, painstakingly and imperfectly, the conditions for trust across a gap that should have been unbridgeable. Now, you may have heard me mention this before, but I really do keep coming back to it. The Harvard Study of Adult Development and the book by Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz called The Good Life that is all about this. It's the kind of book that can really change your life. I definitely recommend it. But the study itself is the longest running study of adult life ever conducted. Believe it or not, JFK participated in it briefly as an undergraduate, and it's still going after more than 80 years. It set out to answer a simple question. What makes for a good life? What predicts health and happiness and longevity? Stuff like that. They tracked hundreds of humans across decades, measuring everything they could possibly measure. And the answer, when it came to them, was not wealth or achievement or status or even physical health. It was so basic that they basically give it away on the first page of the book. It was relationships, specifically whether you had people you could genuinely rely on when things got hard and that you could help in turn. Not the number of friends, not how social you were, just whether in the difficult moments there was somebody there for you and whether you were there for them. That was it. Grace is, at the start of this book, the study's worst case. A man with no one waiting at home. That's partially the reason he was selected, who wakes up completely alone in the most isolated situation in human history. By every measure, he should be lost. And what saves him isn't a better plan or a stroke of genius. It's Rocky. It's the utterly improbable fact of another person, or something enough like a person, meeting him in the darkness and staying there with him. Because we all go through those dark times, I'm telling you. It's not a Hollywood observation, it's just true. And what gets us through them, what the data in the Harvard survey has consistently shown, what this strange, cheerful, emotionally moving book and film quietly demonstrate, is that we're not strong enough to get through it alone. That's not how it works. It's also that we don't have to be. That connection and that friendship is what gives us hope. So, huge spoilers, but Grace doesn't go home. That's the ending. And I think it's worth contemplating for a moment, because it's a stranger and more honest ending than it first appears. He could go home at any time. The Hail Mary is there, repaired and ready, in orbit above Iridium. There's a way back, at least in theory, and Earth is still there, still recovering, still the place that contains everything that he came from. And yet he stays. He stays on a planet that he can't survive on without life support, and a civilization that isn't his, to teach science to young Iridians who've never met humanity and will only know it through him. It's not really a triumphant ending. There's no parade and no return to the life he left as a saviour and hero, partly because he didn't really have a life back there. A man on a mission with nothing to lose. That's kind of who he was. Except by the end, he does have something. He has Rocky. He has a relationship that cost them both a great deal and has changed what each of them is capable of believing about each other and themselves, and by extension, about anyone sufficiently different. He just stays, the way you would stay for someone who has become, without your quite noticing it, the person you trust most in the universe. We asked at the beginning what you would risk to find out whether a stranger could ever become a friend. Here's what Grace risked: everything. Now, I'm not a Buddhist, but perhaps I really want to be, because I think about Buddhism way too much. I marvel at it, really, and the people who practice it. And the Buddhist has a way of staying open to the world, of risking themselves again and again every day, knowing that they may be hurt, that their open hand may be slapped away. And I always think to myself, how do they do it? How do they keep doing it? And I'm told they know something that we don't. That the alternative, closing off ourselves, doesn't actually protect us. It actually hurts us more. It's just a different kind of a loss. A friend once told me that, yep, sure, the hand gets slapped away every now and then, and you reach out again, not because you're naive, but because you understand that the reaching is the point. And one day, it might just save the universe. But that's it for now. So until next time, be wise and be kind, and hey, sometimes we all feel like...
I put the knot in astronaut.